This evening, as we continue through our study of the Acts of the Apostles, or some of the Acts of some of the Apostles, we're in the 25th chapter. The 25th chapter, and depending on how swiftly we may be able to move through this, being that this is really a bridge chapter. What I mean by a bridge chapter is it's a linking chapter. It just gives us a brief synopsis of just some key events that leads to this big scene there in the 26th chapter when Paul is there before Agrippa and begins to plead his case. And of course, we know how that case ultimately ends because we've read it already. We've read it probably a few times throughout our lives, some of those key things there, and how at that point, after he spends some time there pleading his case before Agrippa, he is found to be innocent, but he had already appealed to Caesar, and so to Caesar he must go. And so that's, hopefully we can get through there and get there this evening and be able to send Paul off to Rome, and Lord willing be able to pick up with him heading to Rome the next time that we study together. But if you remember, Felix had already tried Paul. And does Felix find Paul really guilty of anything? No, and he doesn't really know what to do. And so because he doesn't really know what to do, he makes a simple decision, right? There's a majority here, and the majority is the Jews, and I really don't want them to be rioting very much around us anymore. So I'll just kind of keep him under house arrest for about 2 years' time span. Before he would finally be removed from office, and then Festus would take over. And because Festus takes over, to do the Jews a favor, instead of releasing Paul, what does Felix do? He keeps him locked up. Festus becomes governor of the area, ruler of the area, the one whom ultimately now is in control to a certain degree. And he would only reign for just a few years, really from 60 AD to about 62 AD. So 2 to 3 years he's reigning there until he dies. And then comes Albinus, who would be his successor, who is said to be very, very wicked there. But nonetheless, we see Festus here at this point taking not really the throne, but at least taking up this office there. So let's read some in the 25th chapter. The 25th chapter, we'll look at the first few verses of this and try to talk about it at least some this evening. Verse 1 says, Festus then, having arrived in the province 3 days later, went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul, and they were urging him, requesting a concession against Paul, that he might have him brought to Jerusalem, at the same time setting an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in custody at Caesarea, and that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore, verse 5, he said, let the influential men among you go there with you, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. So we have Festus there, and he is, of course, being approached by the Jews. Felix didn't do exactly what they wanted at that point. Festus, maybe you will do what we're wanting. And what have they asked him to do? Festus has come from Caesarea. He's in Jerusalem. What do the Jews ask him to do?
Ultimately, they want him dead.
Yeah, they want him dead. But they're wanting him to bring him here to Jerusalem so that they can kill him. My Bible puts that in parentheses, which really carries that idea. Festus didn't know that that was really their intention necessarily. But what do we see here? Regardless of his intention, of their intentions or not, his understanding of their intentions or not, what does he say?
He said, no, he's not going.
Yeah, we're not doing that. He's over there. I'm headed home. I've got a busy schedule, and so I'm headed out. And in fact, he's going to tell them, look, if you've got any charges you want to bring against him, come on. Get your best speakers, get your witnesses, come on, charge him there. I think Festus knew. Perhaps he's read some of their annuals or something like that. about the prosecution against Paul already. There's nothing, there's no guilt against him. It's really a witness protection program to a certain degree. It's just protecting Paul there in prison. But nonetheless, time goes by. My Bible says 8 to 10 days goes by. And then he goes back to Caesarea. Verse 6 continues and says, on the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought in. After Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him. Note this, which they could not prove. We'll stop there for just a moment. This is the same old, isn't it? This is the same thing that has happened time and time again. You have a ruler appointed by Rome who, after hearing a charge against, you look at Jesus, you look at Paul, and even some of the others, they can find no wrong there. The witnesses, they cannot agree. They cannot prove their points. And Festus, at this point, he's listening in. He's taking to note what's said. And Paul, now in verse 8, he is going to speak. He is going to speak out against those, or in his own defense against those who have had power among the Jews. And I didn't note that necessarily back in those first few verses, verse 4 and 5 there when Festus said, let those who have power among you go with me. He's asking for the influential people. And if you recall back to the first trial with Paul there under Felix, who did the Jews, the chief priests, send? A talented lawyer, a talented orator, one who was very crafty in speech. And yet they still, then and now, can find no wrong in him. They can't prove any of their points. You continue on in verse 8. Paul then comes to his own defense. He says this, I have committed no offense, either against the law of the Jews or against the temple of Caesar. And I think that's important. He points this out again about the temple there, which, if you recall, that was the whole reason why the Jews attacked him to begin with, right? Supposing him to be the one having brought a Gentile into the temple. He did no such thing. He says, I have not done anything against their temple. But note who else he says he has done nothing against.
Caesar.
Yeah, Caesar. And the Caesar reign and rule around this time is slowly becoming a godlike thing where Caesar is being worshipped as a god to a certain degree. And that is beginning to take place and will certainly come into practice over the course of the next 10 to 20 years there. But at this point he says, I've done nothing to Caesar. Remember a certain tax situation that Jesus found himself in, how he was being charged? And what was Jesus' statement about the taxes there that they were being charged? Give to Caesar.
What's Caesar's,
Yeah.
to God what's God.
Give to Caesar's what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God. He sends them go get the coin out of the fish's mouth. We remember that story, of course. Paul says, I've done nothing wrong even in the eyes of Caesar. In everything that I could be tried for, done no wrong. Verse 9. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, Are you willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and I have committed anything wrong of death, or worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." Think about what Paul just said there. There's no sense in me going to a lower court at this point. He's already been in the lower courts. Has that helped any? No. Does Paul know of the Jews' intentions? Well, he knew about it before when he was going to Felix. He likely knows about it now. We don't know if he does or not. He probably would assume, though, being that these charges are coming up again 2 years later, you want me to go to Jerusalem? Last time I was going from Jerusalem to Caesarea. He probably can put 2 and 2 together, don't you think? So what does he say? Yet again, I've done no wrong. If I've done wrong, try me right now, right here. Had he done any wrong? No, he didn't. Festus couldn't try him any longer. Festus knows he's innocent. They can't get their stories to line up. And so who does he appeal to? Who does he appeal to? To Caesar. He appeals to Caesar. And then verse 12, then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, "You have appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you shall go." The appeal to Caesar, not just anyone could do that. That was one of his privileges as a Roman citizen. It was meant for such cases like this. When you're being tried and mistreated and there is nothing that you've done wrong, that's what that appeal was for. Look, nothing's going to happen here. We're getting nowhere. I appeal unto Caesar. And so you go to that highest of high courts. Festus didn't know of everything going on. Festus just sees this man who is innocent.
Don't you think Paul might have had some other reasons that he wanted to go to Rome?
Oh yes, definitely so.
He just used this as a way to get there.
Certainly so. But I think also, if he goes back to Jerusalem, he knows in his mind he's going to be killed. And so, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why he's wanting to go to Rome, but certainly to preach and teach there as well. That had been a desire of his already. So, what could have Festus have done? What could he have done? He could have let him go, right? He knows he's innocent.
Well,
could have let him
I'm
go.
not positive of that after he specifically appealed to Caesar. I don't know if he had any control over it.
Well, right. Once he appealed to Caesar, it's kind of out of his hands. And Agrippa makes that very clear in the next chapter. Had he not appealed to Caesar, he's innocent. We have to let him go. Prior to him appealing, he could have let him go. He could have forced him to go back to Jerusalem. That wouldn't go over well, though, because that word would get back, especially with him appealing unto Caesar. But with this appeal...
You don't normally ask a prisoner, though, would you like to go to Jerusalem?
Right.
Give him a choice.
Give him a choice. I think he's giving him the choice because he knows there's no reason for you to be in my court right now, right? This should have been settled back at the lawyer's office, not here. And so Festus is left with his only other option now, because he has appealed to Caesar. Well, then I have to send you to Rome. However, there's an interesting side point that comes up. Who's coming into town? Who arrives in Caesarea? Agrippa. Yeah, King Agrippa at this point. Let's see, do I have anything on these about...
I reckon Bernice was his wife. I'm not sure.
Sister. I think it's a sister.
Right.
He comes in and he reigns... well, let's back up some. Acts chapter 12. Herod Agrippa, number 1. He dies about AD 44. And this Herod Agrippa, they said, this according to history books and commentaries, They said he was too young to assume throne and assume reign at that point. So it would be a few years later when he would finally get to be king and kind of rule there in that area. And so we know a little bit about them and how as the Herod family begins to rule and reign, they claim to be Jews, but they aren't really full practicing Jews. And they even, and I think you may have pointed this out last week, they're the ones who started to appoint certain men as chief priests and priests. So they're not even following the full law anymore anyway. So there's a lot of issue with the Herod's families, and we're not going to get into all those this evening. You can read about it. You can read about the incest and the issues that they had, even with Bernice and how she played. And there's a lot of stuff there. And we don't have all the time to go through that. But we can talk a little bit about this. King Agrippa II, son of Agrippa I, great-grandson of Herod the Great. So we're following that legacy here now. Where do we leave off? Verse 13. Now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. While they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man who is left as a prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face, and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. So after they had assembled there, I did not delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought before me. When the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion, and, note this, about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul has insisted is alive. Being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. Let's stop there. Now, most of that is just a recap, right? But we learn a fine detail that's not mentioned there when it comes to Paul and the Jews and Festus. We understand that that is what was being talked about. That's what was on trial. And why do we already understand that without reading it here in these verses? Because we know the context from the previous chapters. We know what the issue is. And so here, he brings that up. But what I find so interesting there is why might Agrippa want to hear Paul?
Curiosity, I guess.
Yeah, curiosity. That's the only reason I can think of. He knows a little bit about Jesus. He should know a little bit about Jesus. It's his family that took part in his life. Ought to know a lot about it. But he certainly should know a lot about the Jews and their culture, especially professing to be one. So, if he knows anything about the way, and as we're going to note here in the next chapter, when he speaks out, he talks about Christians, so we know he knows a little more than just a little about the way. He wants to hear what Paul has to say. Some say it's just out of curiosity. Others say it's because he really is intrigued by it, wanting to know if this man can prove to me that Jesus is alive. I don't know if that's the case or not, but it's interesting to think about. So Festus decided that it would be best tomorrow you will hear him. So let's keep reading. Paul is going before Agrippa now in verse 23. Next day, when Agrippa came together with Bernice and amid great pomp and circumstance entered the auditorium, accompanied by the commanders of the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, "King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here present with us, you see this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer." Stop there. That wasn't mentioned, was it? But now we know something else that happened at the trial. They were still blood-hungry men. Just like when Pilate and Herod and Pilate again could not find any wrong with Jesus, how did the Jews respond? They were blood-hungry. He's been scourged. He's been beaten. He's had a crown of thorns placed on his head. Surely he's been punished enough. But they were blood-hungry, weren't they? Crucify him, they shout. We now learn just a little more about what all Festus actually knows. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, since he himself has appealed unto Caesar. I decided to send him, yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my Lord. Therefore I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems absurd to me in sending a prisoner and not to indicate also the charges against him. Yeah, Festus was caught between a rock and a hard place. He would be the laughing stock of the courts if he sent Paul there without anything wrong that he's done. Because all Paul will have to say to Caesar is, look, I've done nothing wrong. The Jews can't agree with what they're charging me. They can't find any fault, and even in their customs and their laws. So I've had to come here because Festus can't get the job done. I don't know if he'd say it like that. He might have a little more tact. But Festus knows he can't send him like this. And rightfully so. As Festus is making his appeal to Agrippa there, or giving the opening remarks there to Agrippa, did you notice how he's not really exalting Agrippa up like some of the other orators that have come in to speak before these councils, where they're trying to appeal to their mind's mentality? He calls him Agrippa. He calls him king. He's very casual there. He just states, I don't really know what to do. And that's why I've agreed to let him talk to you. And for you to talk to him. On the
hierarchy list, how is Festus and Felix alike and different? So
they're running the same. Festus and Felix are running, they're the same level as a governor.
Agrippa comes in, so
Agrippa's a king. He's higher up.
Higher.
He's higher up. In particular, he would be over the regions there of Jerusalem. So he has a little more authority, a little more clout to him. Mostly because the Jews wanted a king. They wanted someone over, and so he's kind of appointed there by the Caesars for that. Some say they don't really have a lot of authority other than just...
figurehead?
Yeah, pretty much. It's almost like the Queen of England. While she seems like she has a lot of authority, and most people are very interested in that, England has a president. They have, I think he's called something else. So they have someone else, who's actually their authority, but she's that figurehead, right? Anyways, so Herod's kind of like that. But they would have to pay their respects nonetheless to him. And of course, Herod back to Caesar. So in these few moments that we have left, let's note some of these things that are going to take place in the 26th chapter. Paul's going to make his defense before Agrippa, right? Agrippa says to Paul, verse 1, "You are permitted to speak for yourself. Then Paul stretched out his hand and proceeded to make his defense. Some will use this to say this gives a right to talk with your hands, right? He's putting his hand out there. And it's just like that. King, and notice what he says. In regard to all the things which I am accused by the Jews, I consider myself fortunate, King Agrippa, that I am about to make my defense before you today. See, Paul wanted that audience. He wanted to be there before these rulers, before the authorities, because they need to make some decisions. And Agrippa, especially, being a Jew, and Paul's going to ask him a question. Don't you believe in the prophets? And that's going to kind of cut him deep, because now he has to make a decision. Yes, I believe in the prophets, and if he says yes to believing in the prophets, he's then forced to believe in the resurrection of the dead. He's forced to believe in the coming of the Messiah, and now he's got to make a decision about Jesus. If he says no, what does that do? If he says no when Paul asks him in a moment, do you believe the prophets?
He says, I know you believe the prophets.
He says, I know you do. And so he's going to be left with that, to really think. He's got to make these decisions. Let's keep reading, especially verse 3. Because you are an expert in all customs and questions among the Jews. Therefore, I beg of you, listen to me patiently. That all Jews know my manner of life from my youth up, which from the beginning was spent among my own nation at Jerusalem, since they have known about me for a long time. If they are willing to testify that I lived as a Pharisee according to the strictest sect of our religion, and now I am standing trial for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers, the promise to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly serve God both night and day. And for this hope, O King, I am being accused by the Jews. Why is it considered incredible among you people if God does raise the dead? There's a lot of things there. The first thing that we note is how Paul recounts his heritage and points to Agrippa. You know these things. These are a part of your heritage as well. He also points out who he was as a Jew. And he wasn't just a common Jew. He wasn't just a Jew who went to school and studied a lot. Rather, what kind of Jew was he? A Pharisee. The strictest of sects there. In fact, later in one of his letters, he calls himself the Pharisee of Pharisees. There is something a Pharisee should do or should be about. That's who Paul was prior to Christ. And he calls out how he's on trial. What is he claiming he's on trial for? The promises of God. The things that we've been working so hard for, that we've been living for to this very day. Now that's an appeal, isn't it? That's a strong opening statement, isn't it? And I love the question that he left there in verse 8. Why is it considered incredible among you people if God does raise the dead? Remember, the reason he is claiming to be on trial initially was for the resurrection of the dead when he was there with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And he is. The resurrection of who?
Jesus.
That's right. Jesus the Christ. Verse 9. So then I thought to myself that I had to do many things hostile to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. So he says, look, as a Jew, that's what I was about. When this man rose up, I knew I had to put an end to it. Makes you wonder whether or not if he was there, perhaps among some of those Jews who were shouting, crucify him. It really does make you wonder. Verse 10. And this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, but also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. And as I punished them often in all the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme, and being furiously enraged at them, I kept pursuing them even into foreign cities. That's all true. That's all true. When we get a glimpse into the mindset of the man that we knew as Saul of Tarsus, what happens next in the following verses? Something changes, doesn't it? That resurrection of the dead that he is on trial for, he's about to talk about it. Verse 12. While I was engaged as I was journeying to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests at midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining all around me and those who were journeying with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew dialect, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. And I said, Who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and stand on your feet, for this purpose I have appeared unto you, to appoint you a minister and a witness, not only to the things which you have seen, but also to the things in which I will appear to you, rescuing you from the Jewish people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the dominion of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me. So, King Agrippa, I did not prove disobedient to the heavenly vision. I kept declaring both to those of Damascus first, and also at Jerusalem, and then throughout all the region of Judea, even to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds appropriate to repentance. For this reason, some Jews seized me in the temple and tried to put me to death. So having obtained help from God, I stand to this day testifying both small and great, stating nothing but what the prophets and Moses said was going to take place, that the Christ was to suffer, and that by reason of his resurrection from the dead, he would be first to proclaim light from the Jewish people and to the Gentiles. Well, as Paul is wrapping up those closing remarks there, some interesting stuff he has said. We get some more information there about what all Paul had seen and saw there on that road to Damascus, something that maybe I noted at a different time, but for some reason it seemed like it was brand new to me this evening. He called out how Jesus was actually talking, and what language did Jesus speak to him in? The Hebrew language. And I'm sure that I've read that and noted that many times, but it just jumped out to me there. This is a language that Paul would know the most, one that he was very well fluent in, because he was reading it daily. He was studying it more than anyone else. And besides, between Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, the three common languages within the city, it would all become kind of muddied together at times. And so he points that out. But notice what else he points out. That man Jesus has appointed him to do something. And who or what was Paul appointed for?
One of his primary things was to go to the Gentiles.
That's right. To the Jews, to the Gentiles, to preach and to teach the forgiveness of sins. And that's what he would do. And he's saying, and this is why I'm on trial. Because I obeyed a heavenly vision. And notice he calls out how he has these witnesses of these things that took place too. What did he say? He was traveling with a group of people, and when the light shone bright, it shone not just around Paul, but all about them, and they fell to the ground. And then Paul was summoned to stand up. Verse 24, running out of time here. There's just a couple things that we can note here in this last part of the text. While Paul was saying this in his defense, note what Festus says. Paul, you are a madman. You are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad. But Paul said, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. For the king knows about these matters, and I speak to him with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice. For this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do. And Agrippa replied to him, in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. And Paul said, I would wish to God that whether in a short or long time, not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. The king stood up, the governor, Bernice, those who were sitting with him, and when they had gone aside, they began talking, one with another, saying, this man has done nothing worthy of death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. A couple things there. We have Festus shouting out. You can just see this sermon is one of the great sermons, or this speech is one of the great speeches that we have in the book of Acts. I think we can agree with that. And as he's there in that sermon, Festus is just getting so fired up over it. And he's like, you're going crazy here. You are a madman. But was he a madman? No, he wasn't mad at all. Wasn't mad at all. He had obeyed the heavenly vision. Festus cries out, interrupting, I'm not crazy, O excellent Festus, but rather the king understands everything that I'm talking about. This shows that Festus may not have been up to date on all the Jewish laws and customs. Might not have been up to date on the prophets. But the king was.
He might have had something to do with his age too, if he was a very young man.
Mm-hmm. Might have. But the king knew. And he's asked a rhetorical question. And then we have that statement. Statement that has been, sermons have hinged on that statement. King James said, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. One commentator wrote about that, suggesting that perhaps he was saying it rhetorically, which may call for, not rhetorically, facetiously. he was just being a little witty there with Paul, and Paul becomes a little witty with him. I disagree with that because you see,
I've heard that too, and I disagree with it.
I disagree with it. You know, I see this sincerity at this point. Paul has laid the facts out, and nonetheless, the man, he has to answer. And based on the facts, based on the evidence, Agrippa is left with one choice. I need to either obey Christ or prove Christ wrong. And he can't prove Christ wrong. The evidence demanded a verdict. And so he says, in a short time, you will persuade me. And then Paul's famous response, whether short or long, not only you, but I wish that all would become as I. Well, Paul appealed to Caesar, and in his appeal unto Caesar, he is now going to be sent on his merry way, I guess, if we want to say that. It's an eventful trip, isn't it? Very eventful on the way over. Lord willing, we'll pick up in chapter 27 the next time that we're together, and we'll talk a little bit about Paul's journey to Rome and how he has these other prisoners with him and how they're delivered over to Julius. We'll stop for just a moment and wait for everyone else to come back in.